Good afternoon and welcome to the sixth in our series of virtual roadshows on our new relationship with the EU. Our last session looked at VAT and the implications for business. Today we'll be drilling down into product labelling and how to navigate the rules correctly. Firstly, we'll hear from Ben Luccan, Business Readiness Team Leader at BEIS, and then from Chris Newson, Head of Learning, Health, Safety and Sustainability here at Make UK. We will look at a broad overview of the policy, certification from notified bodies, and the practical and technical implications for GB manufacturers when labelling goods and machinery. There'll be a short Q&A session after the presentations. However, before we begin, just a few quick housekeeping items to note. All attendees are in listening mode only, and only the panelists' videos are visible. If you want to engage with the panelists or ask a question, please do so by typing your question in the Q&A box in the Zoom control bar at the bottom of your screen. Aaron Moran and I will be moderating any questions during the Q&A session, which will follow the presentations. We're not using the chat function with so many of you on the call, and this also means that we can get a printout of questions and make sure they're followed up afterwards. Finally, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on the website afterwards, and all participants will be sent a follow-up pack with the slides which you'll be seeing today. So with no further ado, please let me hand over to Ben Luccan from BEIS. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks very much, Hilary. Aaron's just going to quickly share my slides on screen now. I'm not going to put my camera on for this presentation, all just because I'm having a bit of Wi-Fi issues, but I'll introduce myself anyway. So my name's Ben and I'm from the Goods Regulation team here at BEIS, and we cover the policy for the new Ukca and Ce marking and issues related to us exiting the European Union. And I'm going to talk to you today about the rules and the changes in relation to placing goods on the market in Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Aaron, would you be able to put it in slideshow mode if that's okay?
That's you should be able to see it in slideshow mode now, Ben, I think.
No, it's not in presentation mode, Aaron, yet.
No, apologies.
Yeah, no worries. So in the presentation, I'm going to cover this definition around placing on the market, the rules for continuing to use CE for the rest of this year, and also the rules around Ukca and Ce and using the UKNI marking for Northern Ireland when that's required, and also the position around unfettered access and those things too. So I think Aaron, if you go to slideshow mode, which is in the top left with the play button near save, it should go into slideshow mode and we should be able to work them through. There we go. So if we go to the next slide, please. Great. So first thing is just a quick bit of an overview about different regulations for goods. Okay. So this presentation and this policy area relates to what are called new approach goods, which isn't a business-friendly term, let's say, and it just refers to the legislative framework that was that's in place in the EU for goods regulated by directives which have essential requirements, and then harmonised standards are used to achieve compliance to those. So those goods which you usually identify through a CE marking, those now are required to have the Ukca and Ce marking for the Great British market, and I'll talk through that in a moment. So that's the focus of today. So think about things like toys, personal protective equipment, machinery, those sorts of things under that common regulatory framework. You'll see on this slide as well, to the right of that, there's a category called old approach goods, right? And I'm not going to talk about those today, because what old approach relates to are those specific areas with detailed regulation models governing them. So things like cars, chemicals, aerospace, that sort of thing. I'm not going to cover that today. And just another couple of buckets here. So there are some sector-specific rules for certain new approach goods. Again, those that bear the CE marking. And those are things like medical devices, construction products, and civil explosives. I'm not going to go into those today, but I will talk through the general rules which affect the vast majority of products. Can I get the next slide, please, Aaron? So the key actions for business, really important to just quickly give an overview of these and to give a headline statement about where we are today. So the essential requirements and standards that can be used to demonstrate compliance to the Ukca and Ce marking are the same as they were for the CE marking as at now. But there are some other changes you might need to make. And what we would encourage you strongly to do as a number of steps is check the regulations that apply to your product. Begin any approval processes as soon as possible if you need them. So I'm talking about mandatory third-party testing here, which I'll cover more in the presentation. The change of status for economic operators, so distributors who may now be importers, and also the impacts on authorised representatives, and the need to label products with an address in the context of being an importer. So these are all things that are really important to check as your obligations have changed, and I'll cover that throughout this presentation. Aaron, next slide, please. Okay, so if we look to 2020, the transition period, goods that you placed on the market during 2020 for the end of the year can continue to circulate until they reach their end user, and that's whether it's on the EU or the UK market. And that's just a really important thing to stress up front, because none of these changes around UKCA, importer responsibilities, economic operator responsibilities and the like, none of those apply to goods which are placed on the market before the end of last year. It's important to consider what placing on the market actually means conceptually. And it's the legal term, so I'll do my best to try and make it accessible. But essentially, we're talking about an offer agreement to transfer possession or ownership of individual fully manufactured goods. So typically, that's going to be something that's been made and somebody's bought it, or it's a good that's been made and it's been passed to a distributor and it's moving through the supply chain onwards towards the end user. That's what we're talking about with placing on the market. And CE mark goods, well, this is something you'll probably have heard a bit about, and hopefully this is positive news as we're doing this to help businesses. CE mark goods can be placed on the GB market until the end of this year. So there's a, if you like, additional transitional period for these goods for Great Britain. In terms of what the position is in the EU side, well, the CE marking continues to apply there, so compliance to EU rules is still required now. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, the requirements for UKCA and CE are the same right now. So if you self-declare for the CE marking, you can self-declare for the UKCA marking. If you require third-party conformity assessment, well, the position is a bit different. So you can only use the CE marking if you've got a certificate from an EU notified body, and you can only use the UKCA marking if you've got a certificate from a UK approved body, right? So there's a distinction between the two. In terms of how the relationship between them, well, the way to think about it is, the UKCA marking, well, that's come into force now and it's applicable and applies and is required in Great Britain, right? And the CE mark is accepted in Great Britain until the end of this year. The UKCA marking is mandatory from the beginning of next year for most goods. And I say most because there are exceptions, things like medical devices. That's worth noting. In terms of, talking about your products and both markings, because you might sell in the EU and you might sell in GB as well. Both can appear on the same product as long as it's destined for both markets and is compliant with the rules for both markets. That's the key thing. And you'll see in this slide here, and happy to share these after. We include links to our guidance which you can scan and find out more about these. But essentially, the point to emphasise is that the essential requirements and standards are the same. The UK designated standards replace harmonised standards, but we're talking about essentially the same thing. So if you comply with CE, you can comply with UKCA quite easily, is what I would say. Next slide, please. So this slide is to cover the timings. And as I've mentioned, goods placed on the market for the end of last year, 2020, they can continue to circulate until they reach their end user. I've said that the UKCA marking and the CE marking, the essential requirements are the same, and the standards are the same to the extent that the UK is using designated standards now, right, that's the difference, and the EU still uses harmonised standards, but right, in substance, they are the same. So it's important to go over the timeline for this, again, because it's just re-emphasising this point. The UKCA marking does apply now, and you only need to use it right now if your certificate of conformity is from a UK approved body, if you have one. Another thing to be aware of this year, which is coming into force, is the EU's market surveillance and compliance of products regulation. And what it does is it requires you to have a EU representative in place when there's no other economic operator there. So no importer, no distributor, no fulfillment service provider, nothing like that. And of course, that only applies to you if you export to the EU and Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland remains in regulatory alignment with the EU, which I'll cover later. As I said, UKCA is mandatory for most goods from the beginning of next year. And I say most because it is longer in some cases, things like medical devices. Another thing we've done as well, so we've got this 1 year transitional period, if you like, where the CE mark is accepted, which is something we've introduced to help businesses. Another thing we've done is with the UKCA marking becoming mandatory in 2022, we're allowed the UKCA to be affixed using a label or for it to appear in an accompanying document until 2023, so 1 year after. So that applies now and it applies until 2023. From then, well, the question of how you affix the UKCA marking is it's based on the legislation. So compliance to whatever the legislation says is what's relevant for you. And you can find the legislation on the guidance we provide on placing goods on the Great British market, which a QR code is included for in this slide pack, which will circulate after. Could I get to the next slide, please? So I've alluded to this throughout, and it's important to take a step back and think about, this is something that many of you will be aware of, but in terms of actually, sort of demonstrating compliance, and, as a manufacturer or the manufacturer's authorised representative, there are two things that can be done. One is self-declaring compliance against the essential requirements of regulations. That's one thing. And the other is having third-party conformity assessment done on your goods, which is required under certain regulations for certain products. So it's quite commonly used for construction products, certain types of PPE, certain types of pressure equipment. And in those circumstances, a manufacturer is required legally to go to a third-party conformity assessment body, so a testing body, and have their goods checked against the essential requirements of the regulations, right? So there are changes that affect this, so this mandatory third-party conformity assessment. If you self-declare compliance against the regulations, you undertake your risk assessment, you satisfy yourself that the product is safe, you sign a declaration of conformity, and that's it. This isn't going to be relevant to you, but it is going to be relevant if you get third-party conformity assessment. So the key changes that are worth noting in relation to the Northern Ireland market, I'll start there, is that UK bodies remain notified bodies, as they're currently called, so bodies which are notified to the Commission as competent to perform conformity assessment against regulations. And the reason for this is because Northern Ireland remains in regulatory alignment with the EU. And this is something I'll stress throughout again, it's because of the Northern Ireland Protocol. From a goods perspective, Northern Ireland remains in regulatory alignment with the EU. So that's Northern Ireland, let's put that to one side a sec. In terms of Great Britain, all UK-based notified bodies automatically became approved bodies for the GB market on the 1st of January this year. And you can find the details of those bodies on the UK Market Conformity Assessment Body database online. So UK approved bodies are those which are recognised as being able to be competent to provide conformity assessment against the UKCA marking, and they exist in either in the UK or countries with which we have a mutual recognition agreement. Now, in terms of mutual recognition agreement, in the negotiations last year, the UK and the EU didn't agree to mutually recognise each other's conformity assessments. So if you need conformity assessment for the EU market against the CE marking, you'll need to get an EU notified body. The UK body can't do that for you. And vice versa, if you need to get conformity assessment against UKCA, so that's certification, an EU body can't do that for you either. So that's a really key point to note. And you can scan the QR code on the slide to find out more about conformity assessment bodies. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is just the point I covered a minute ago about mutual recognition. What we'd encourage businesses to do if they require third-party conformity assessment is to act really soon. So you can use the CE marking for the rest of this year, yes, but if you require certification to sell next year with the UKCA, you need to act as soon as possible because it does take time. It's not something that happens overnight. So it's really important that you do act now, and that if you sell to the EU, as well as selling and placing goods on the GB market, you'll need separate certificates to be ready well in advance beginning next year. So if this sounds like it's relevant, you should act as soon as possible to make sure you can continue selling your goods next year. Next slide, please. So I touched upon this a bit at the beginning, and this is another term which isn't super business friendly, which is economic operator. operators. And what we're referring to, they're defined in the legislation essentially for these types of products. And they are manufacturers, importers, distributors, and authorized representatives. And there are changes, right, because we've left the Europe, we're not in the single market. There are changes affecting the roles and responsibilities of these economic operators. So one thing that's worth noting, and is really important, is that from the beginning of this year, distributors of goods coming from the EU may become importers. And if you're an importer, you have additional responsibilities like making sure your name and address is on the product, right? I say may become importers because, for example, a manufacturer might appoint someone specifically to be an importer for the GB market for them, and someone may remain a distributor. So it's really important, if you're unsure about whether you're an importer or not, to have that conversation with your supplier from the EU or manufacturer to identify who's performing those compliance responsibilities. In most cases, if you're a distributor, if you're now the first person placing goods on the GB market from outside the UK, you're going to be an importer. So really important to familiarise yourself with those responsibilities because they apply now. And another thing, if you appoint authorised representatives, so you're a manufacturer, you appoint authorised representatives, or you are one for a manufacturer, one thing that's really important is that for the GB market, they must be based in the UK. So we don't recognise authorised representatives in the EU anymore, and the same applies vice versa. So really important to know yourself those changes if they affect you. And I mentioned it earlier, market surveillance and compliance products regulation. Familiarise yourself with this. If you are somebody, for example, who sells goods online to customers in the EU or Northern Ireland, you'll need to comply with the requirements. Next slide, please. Great, so I'm going to quickly talk about Northern Ireland now. And this is something I've touched upon throughout. And to say again, the Northern Ireland Protocol is now in force, and it means that Northern Ireland remains in regulatory alignment with the EU from a goods perspective. And that means that the CE marking continues to be the relevant marking for goods placed on the market in Northern Ireland. So if you self-declare for the CE marking, you continue to do that for Northern Ireland, no problem. If you have a certificate of conformity, if you require third-party conformity assessment from an EU notified body, you can continue to use CE marking, that's absolutely fine. There is the new Ukca and Ce marking. It's really important to clarify what this is for specifically, and it applies in a specific circumstance. So it's not for all goods placed on the market in Northern Ireland. It's not. It's just for specific. It's goods that have gone through a specific process, and that is when a UK notified body, and again, I mentioned this earlier, why UK bodies are still called notified bodies for Northern Ireland, because it remains in line with the EU, right? The UK and Ce marking is applied when a UK notified body has provided certification for those goods. So the certification which provides that those goods are compliant with EU rules. And in those circumstances, the CE marking needs to appear on the product as well as the UK and Ce marking, so they always appear together in this circumstance. The UK and Ce marking never appears on its own. So that's a really important thing to be aware of. In terms of the UKCA marking, well, the UKCA marking isn't valid for the Northern Ireland market because it's valid for the GB market and it's not recognised by the EU, and Northern Ireland remains in regulatory alignment with the EU for goods. Next slide, please. Just quickly on, we talked about placing goods on the Northern Ireland market, and there's a point around unfettered access and what that means from a marking perspective. To say up front, I'm not au fait with rules of origin, tariffs, customs, moving goods, and any of those issues in relation to Northern Ireland, so I won't be able to answer any of those questions. But I can answer points around what does unfettered access mean for product marking. This is my area of expertise. That's what I'm here to talk about and can answer questions on, right? So essentially, goods that benefit from unfettered access, so qualified Northern Ireland goods, goods that are in free circulation in Northern Ireland and not subject to any customs control. To paraphrase the definition in the legislation, to read more, look at the guidance that's available online. It's provided at the end of this pack as well. QR code, you can look that up. Essentially, goods that are qualified Northern Ireland goods that benefit from unfettered access can have the CE marking on them, or the CE marking plus UK and Ce when a UK body has performed a conformity assessment for them, for as long as the protocol is in force. So this point around CE marked goods being accepted on the GB market until the end of this year, unfettered access is distinct from that, right? So those goods benefit from unfettered access could be placed on the GB market for longer because the protocol's in force for sort of 4 years, and then it'll be reconsidered again. as part of a democratic consent process internally. But I won't go into that because, as you can tell, it's not something I know much about. Next slide, please. And again, these economic operator responsibilities. So if you bring goods into Northern Ireland from GB or another non-EU country, the EU's importer requirements apply to you. So that's something that's really important to be aware of. And just quickly, in terms of businesses in Northern Ireland placing goods on the GB market from outside the UK, those businesses have those importer responsibilities that I talked about earlier, right? So goods that have come from the EU via NI still need to be labelled with importer details because they're being placed on the GB market. This isn't unfettered access, right? This isn't what's envisioned by it. It's not a qualifying Northern Ireland good. In some cases it might be. So again, if that's of interest to you and it's relevant, look at the relevant guidance we have available online for that. Next slide, please. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. If Aaron, you skip through to the next few slides, just to show people, you can see the QR codes that I mentioned throughout. Yeah, give us the next slide. And the next one. And the next one. There. And if you have any queries on the guidance, email us at goodsregulation@beis.gov.uk. We'll get back to you from there. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. I hope that's helpful. I appreciate it's a lot of information, lots of dates, lots of things to be aware of. So I'll hand back to the team at Make UK and open up to any questions that you might have. Thanks very much.
Lovely. So we'll start with a company that manufactures small electrical connectivity components. Do they have to mark the product with UKCA after the 1st of January 2023, or can we continue to use the UKCA symbol on the product carton?
So this depends on what the legislation says. And to be honest with you, what you're doing for the CE marking will be the same for the UKCA marking. So if you put the CE marking on the carton because the legislation says you can do so because it would be impractical to affix it to the component itself, that's also fine for the UKCA marking. But what I would say is check the legislation. In terms of the dates you've talked about there, it's important to recognise that UKCA is required from the beginning of next year, so it's not until 2023. The point I made in terms of 2022 and 2023, if you follow, is it's mandatory from 2022, but to make it easier for businesses, until 2023, the UKCA marking can be affixed using a sticky label, or it could be on a accompanying document. So it's required from 2022. But
you were breaking up a little bit there. Do you mind saying that again?
Until 2023, you can use a sticky.
Okay, we'll just give Ben a couple of seconds to Aaron. Can you just message Ben in the chat? I don't know if he heard me, but he's breaking up, and we'll just see if we can get him back there.
No problem at all. Why? Because your team have their cameras. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Am I coming through? Hello, can you hear me?
Better, much better. Can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, can hear you now. Perfect.
Oh, excellent. Could you hear me while the presentation was going?
We could hear you.
Okay, cool. So on that question, cool. On that question, so if the legislation requires components to be individually marked, they'll need to bear the UKCA marking. In terms of whether it can go on the product or the carton, I think that depends on the legislation itself. I mean, generally speaking, most legislation says if you can't put it on the product, it can go on the packaging, or if you can't go on the package, it would go on accompanying documentation. But essentially what you're doing for the CE marking now will be okay for the UKCA marking. And I would just stress that UKCA is required from 2022, and until 2023, you can use a sticky label to affix it. I hope that's helpful.
Thanks very much. Aaron, next question.
Next question. Are the EU and other countries that use CE marking also happy with joint labelling?
So is that a question around joint labelling and having them appear side by side?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So yeah, the EU's Blue Guide does talk about multiple markings appearing on the same product as long as they are compliant with the relevant regulatory regimes. I mean, if you look at your laptop charger, there's a plethora of markings on that. So multiple markings appearing concurrently is fine as long as the products are, compliant with the rules associated with the markings that are affixed to them. Hope that helps.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Thanks. This is not one from a company where their products are too small to put their name and address on them. Is it allowed to put this detail onto the product carton?
Yeah, so it's similar to the earlier question. I think it depends what the product is, but the legislation will usually cover what you should do in those circumstances where the product is too small. So usually you'll put it on the packaging or accompanying documentation. And again, what you're doing for CE now for those purposes, if you are importing, for example, into EU, will be fine for the UK. But in terms of importers, right? So until the end of 2022, you can have importer details on the accompanying document, so they don't have to be on the product or packaging just now. So we have provided time for these importer labelling requirements to be met over the course of this year and next year, towards the end of next year, if those goods, for example, are coming from the EU. Hope that makes sense. I mean, it's quite specific, that example is, about the rules around importer labelling, right? So I'd suggest, it's worth reading the guidance and looking at what we've set out there, because it does explain what the position is for importer labelling. But yes, there is an additional easement there too. That's worth looking at the guidance and reading about.
Perfect. Next question. What happens if there is no approved body in the GB market that can assess your product because it is not in their scope of assessment?
So we're looking at the moment about this point around the capacity of our conformity assessment body sector, and we're certainly thinking of options to address this issue. And in, for example, the context of pyrotechnics, which is a sector which I think this question is alluding to, as an area where there isn't an approved body. Our Secretary of State does have legal powers to designate a body outside of the UK. It's quite a special case and an exception, and we're looking into that issue currently. I think that's what the question was related to. So that's all I can say about that just now.
No,
next question. Under the Noise Directive, there are only a very limited number of approved bodies too. One of which covers certain products, the NRMM. All manufacturers will be expected to reach out to this body to get their certification for noise. Are there plans in place to add new bodies as UK approved bodies to cope with the influx of inquiries, and what is the timing for that if that is the case?
Absolutely. So this is something we are actively looking into at the moment. We're very much looking at what we can do to make sure each sector has, the relevant capacity it needs. What we'd encourage businesses to do is to take action as soon as possible to stimulate that demand and get the process going as soon as possible. Because, if lots of businesses leave it until the end of this year to get their certification, it's going to take a long time for the conformity assessment bodies to help and provide that. One of the things as well that's worth considering is, under the withdrawal agreement, if for example your certificate is with an EU notified body, that these bodies are required to share information with each other. So it's worth noting, it's worth inquiring with your existing body to see what their plans might be for providing conformity assessment for the GB market as well, because some conformity assessment bodies are sort of in an international, they're international companies with subsidiaries in many countries, so it's worth asking them too.
Next question. Placing on the market can occur at a later time compared to customs clearance. Is the UK government expecting to see the importer details on the product upon customs clearance or on placing onto the GB market itself? Yeah,
so all these concepts, and I appreciate it's not the most user-friendly thing from a business perspective, but all these concepts I've talked about relate to placing on the market. So customs formalities, declarations, and paperwork is all separate. Think of it as distinct from what we're talking about here with markings and labelling.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect. Next question. For Northern Ireland, if we mark goods/products with both CE and UKCA. Is this okay for the Northern Ireland market?
So the UKCA marking isn't valid for the Northern Ireland market, right? But if those goods are compliant to EU rules and you self-declaring compliance to the CE marking, or you've got certification from an EU notified body, the UKCA marking can appear alongside that. So UKCA doesn't indicate compliance for NI. So on its own, it's not valid. But if your good is compliant with GB rules and you put the UKCA mark on it, and it is compliant with EU rules and you put the CE marking on it for Northern Ireland, it is acceptable for both of them to appear on the same product, as long as they don't impede the visibility and like legibility of each other, and that the products are in fact compliant with both EU and GB rules.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Is the requirement for an address label only on CE or CA marked goods or on all goods?
So this is about what I've talked about today, is about those, you know, these new approach goods, which is that term I talked about at the beginning. So CE mark, UKCA mark goods. I can't provide much insight in terms of other goods, unfortunately, but you know, if you look at our placing on the market guidance for GB, it does include links through to cosmetics, for automotive products, chemicals, all these types of things where there are different rules. So I can't cover it today, but as a first step, you can look at our guidance and look at the link throughs. I hope that's helpful. I appreciate it's a bit of a non-answer, but that's as much as I can say right now.
That's perfect. Next question. We don't have an EU distributor. Can we CE mark and self-certify with our UK address as previous?
So in terms of self-declaring compliance against CE, the EU doesn't require you to be based in the EU to do that. So a manufacturer anywhere can perform that function. They could do it if they're based in China, for example. The point I made throughout the presentation around this new regulation about market surveillance is, for example, if you're selling direct to end users in the EU from GB, or anywhere that's not in the, you know, anywhere that's not part of the single market, you'll need to have an authorized representative in place if that you're not using like a fulfillment service provider. And by that I mean, like, think of like to give an example, other brands are available, but like an Amazon warehouse, they're a fulfillment service provider, or you're not using an importer in the EU or other distributor. So I think the requirements for address labeling and self-declaring aren't affected, but do familiarize yourself with the EU's new regulation coming into force if you are just selling directly to people from outside the EU, because it might require you to take some action.
Here's one. For products that fall under the LVD low voltage directives, specifically with regards to lighting, can you talk about energy labels and if there are differences between the EU and GB requirements, please? Yeah,
so I don't know loads about energy labeling, right? But the essential requirements are the same as at the beginning of this year as they were before. And in terms of the energy label specifically, you can actually go through our guidance for placing goods on the GB market. There is specifically a section on eco-design energy labeling, and it does generate a label for your product. So for things like white goods, so to speak, like freezers, fridges, what have you, where you have an energy sort of rating label on the side, the difference is with labeling that it needs to have a UK flag on it, not an EU one, and the Gov website can generate that for you. If you're asking and interested in terms of like database and things like that, I guess look at the guidance specifically on energy labeling. But fundamentally, all I would say is, yeah, the big difference with labeling that applies now is if we're talking about the same thing with the sort of like eco ratings, like it needs to be a UK flag on it rather than an EU one.
That's perfect. If we export product from the UK to Northern Ireland and these products are CE marked, will we need to have an authorised representative?
So it depends in terms of the timing and the journey the product is taking. Okay, so if you are selling certain products that require you to have an authorised representative, which is not usually the case, but for certain types of machinery it is the case, and for example, cosmetic products, which admittedly aren't regulated by CE, you are required to have a responsible person in place. And I know for certain medical devices, which is regulated by CE, you're required to have an authorised representative. So that's the first consideration. What does the legislation say about your product requirements for an authorised representative. Generally speaking, it's optional, but it could be mandatory in your case, so be familiar with those obligations, right? And then there's a question of timing and who you're selling it to. So if you're selling directly to end users, so customers basically, after the 16th of July, as I mentioned, this market surveillance regulation in the EU comes into force, then you'll need an authorised representative if there's no one else in place. So if there's not an NI importer, or there's no one in NI being a distributor, there's not like a retailer selling it or anything like that, you might need an authorised representative in those circumstances. But generally speaking, if you're self-declaring a CE and you're placing goods on the market in Northern Ireland, and there's an importer or distributor or already an authorised representative, if there's an importer or distributor, you won't need an authorised representative. So check the legislation relevant to your product. Do you need an authorised representative? Mostly it's not the case, but it is the case in specific circumstances. And then also, what's the journey your product's going through? Are you selling direct to end users? If so, be familiar with the new market surveillance compliance products regulation, because it applies in Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland is aligned with the EU still.
This next question is asking about if a CE mark product comes from NI and is placed on the GB market, will it have a special NI CE mark? Otherwise, how do we know it's accepted? If not, then how can we as an Isle of Wight based company place a CE marked product on the GB market? Will UKCA be enforced?
Yeah, so if a good is a qualifying Northern Ireland good and it benefits from unfettered access, it can have the CE marking on it, be placed on the GB market, or or it can have the C plus UK9 marking on it and be placed on the GB market. That's fine. This year, while we're continuing to recognise the CE marking, it doesn't really matter where the good comes from, to be honest with you, whether it's from the Isle of Wight or Russia or anywhere else. CE marking is fine for the GB market this year. For the beginning of next year, UKCA marking is required regardless of where the good is from, unless it's a qualifying Northern Ireland good, which is a good that's in free circulation in Northern Ireland, not subject to any customs controls, procedures, that sort of thing. Again, paraphrasing definition, but check the guidance on unfettered access if that's something that is relevant to your business. We're talking about qualifying Northern Ireland goods, you're a manufacturer based in Northern Ireland or something like that, look into it in that case. But otherwise, the most important thing is all about like compliance to the rules and placing on the market, and like regardless of where the product is coming from.
That's perfect. Next question. Are competition considerations going to be given in terms of certified bodies? In our industry, there is only one UK-based notified body, which would create a monopoly situation.
No, it's a good point, and not something I've thought about a lot. I mean, this is all really useful intel. So, do the email address I provided in the presentation, goods regulation at BEIS, like this is all stuff that's really helpful. So, if for example we have anyone on the line who works in a conformity assessment body, or is involved in the sector, like do get in touch with these sorts of things, because we're really interested to know. And again, like we're looking into this issue of sort of limited capacity in certain sectors. Can't say any more about it right now, but do get in touch with us with particular points or comments on this sort of thing, because we're very interested to hear it from the people who are in these sectors out there in the world, if you like.
Next question. Are ROHS restriction of hazardous substances exemptions the same granted by the EU, and what will be their expiry date?
Yeah, I don't know the answer to this. There is guidance on our website about ROS stuff, but I can't say any more.
Okay, no worries, thank you. Maybe we can get the link and we'll pop it across to the person who's asked this afterwards. Next question, Aaron.
Next question. Can you clarify that the address labelling requirement is only for CE/CA marked products? The advice on gov.uk seems to suggest that all products might need an address label.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think it depends on the type of product. I've talked today about the UKCA CE requirements, right? So what I've said today applies for those. For other areas, check the topic specific guidance is all I could say right now.
Okay. Next question. Can you put the UKCA and CE marks on the same product? And what if there's not enough space for both?
Yeah, so you can place them on the same product. In terms of there being not enough space for both. I guess it depends on what the regulations say. If the regulations say you can put it on a packaging or accompanying document, comply with what's set out there is what I would advise.
That's perfect. Next question. You mentioned that CE marking and UKCA may diverge in the future. Is that also the case with UK NI and UK CA marking?
Yeah, it would naturally, of course. So the UK and I marking, the way to think about it is to indicate that a UK conformity assessment body has assessed against EU rules, and because the EU doesn't recognise our bodies, the UK and I marking stops those products being placed on the EU market outside of Northern Ireland. So if CE diverges, UK and I is just saying that a UK body is tested against the requirements for CE. Like, there are no separate distinct requirements for UK and I. It's assessment by a UK body against EU rules. So if EU rules diverge, it's different for CE and UK and I pull one way, UKCA pulls the other way, if you like. UK and I is just to indicate that UK bodies perform the testing against the CE regime of the EU. That's all it does.
Thank you.
Last one, still on conformity assessment bodies. Can I use at the moment a conformity assessment body outside the UK to certify my goods for the UK market? If I can, will this stop?
So if it's a body that's recognised under a mutual recognition agreement, right? It's like one in the US or Australia, they could do that. And if you've got a UK approved body that subcontracts, if you like, to a body outside the UK, but it's still under the auspices, to pick a word to describe it. It's under the auspices of the UK body that is approved and accredited by UCAS. Yes, that is the case. But you for example, couldn't go to an EU notified body in Belgium that doesn't have a UK presence and is not accredited by UCAS, is not going to be able to do that for you. So it's all about whether it's accredited by UCAS or whether it's part of a mutual recognition agreement between the UK and another country. So really important to emphasise that distinction.
Thanks very much. Ben, thank you very much for both the presentation and for that mammoth Q&A session. We're probably coming to the end of our time. Don't forget, people who are attending, that we'll be sending out the slides after the roadshow is over. And if you have any other questions, I'm sure we'll be able to get the relevant links and answers for you as well. So thank you very, very much, Ben. That was incredibly helpful.